Because I have my notes in front, I'm just wondering if the easiest way to let me know when to go.
Yeah, we'll give you a verbal cue.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Okay, just hit record and I'm going to enable the waiting room. You all ready?
Ready, Kim?
Awesome, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Canadian Academy of Engineering and National Engineering Month, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you, the CAE Fellows, members of other academies and organizations and students to this webinar on mentoring women in engineering. This presentation is dedicated to all engineers across the country in recognition of their excellent work. My name is Kim Keating, Chief Operating Officer with the CAE Group and Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering. To inform our students and members of other organizations who may not be familiar with our organization, the Academy is the national institution through which Canada's most distinguished and experienced engineers provide strategic advice on matters of critical importance to Canada. The Academy is an independent, self-governing, and not-for-profit organization established in 1987 and is one of the 3 national academies that make up the Council of Canadian Academies. We have over 800 fellows from across Canada, all of whom have made significant contributions to engineering in Canada in the private, public, and academic sectors. I should also mention that the views and opinions being expressed here today are those of the speakers and myself and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Academy. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items and explain the format for our online proceedings. I'm sure many of you have attended past webinars and you will know that you are muted upon entry into the webinar. If you have a question anytime during the presentation, we invite you to use the chat function and we will do our best to answer your questions today. And for your information, this session is being recorded and will be available on our website. After my remarks, our first distinguished speaker, Samantha Espley, will share her views on our topic. Samantha's presentation will include an overview of the mining industry, the representation of women over time and events that have influenced that evolution, research into the satisfaction of women in the mining industry, and the importance of mentoring and sponsorship roles to women. After Samantha's presentation, our next distinguished speaker, Sarah Shortreed, will discuss trends for women in technology and women in cyber, and the top 3 things you and your mentor or mentees should be talking about. After these presentations, I will open the floor to answer your questions. And finally, I will ask each panelist to provide their concluding remarks for 1 minute. On that note, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Samantha Espley. Samantha is the president of the Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy, and Petroleum, with her focus on the business strategy, including the ways in which to enrich and expand the engagement of SIM members across Canada and internationally, and build a solid resource personal development, as well as for the industry's benefits and access to cutting-edge innovation, information and standards, guidelines, and best practices. Samantha serves on many advisory guidance on boards of the Center of Excellence in Mining and Innovation, Morocco, Verity International Advisory Board for the Laurentian University School of Engineering, the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and she is active in supporting Global Mining Guidelines Group, Science North, Women in Mining, Women in Science and Engineering, Neo Kids Foundation, and she is also the president and CEO of Drocor. Samantha is a professional engineer in Ontario with engineering degrees from the University of Toronto and Laurentian University, and she is a fellow with the Canadian Academy of Engineering. Samantha is honored to receive numerous distinctions and awards for her efforts, including the Governor General's Gold Medal, CIM Distinguished Service Medal, Women in Mining Trailblazers Award, Engineers Canada Award, Laurentian University's Achievement Award, University of Toronto's Mid-Career Award, and the Professional Engineers of Ontario Award for Engineering Management. Samantha, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kim, and welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to open my presentation for you, and I'll get to a bit of a conversation with everybody. So let me just start by just saying that I'm really honored to be talking about this topic. It's near and dear to my heart. I've been in the mining industry for more than 30 years, and I know the value of mentoring, and I hope to share some of my experiences with you. You know, these are my personal experiences, my insights, Samantha's observations over her career, right? And so a little bit of my research and analysis, some things that I would just ask for your consideration, if you like, just to see what you think in terms of how this may apply in your world. I wanted to start with a little bit of the research that I did into the mining industry. And just for context, I entered the industry 30 years ago. And I do recall, a very distinct moment in my career when I walked into what we call the warm room, the waiting area at a mine site. And I noticed I was the only woman in that area. And I was quite, I would say naive probably at the time, not to recognize that there were so few women in the industry. And so this is really for all of us as a little bit of education, if you like, on what has happened over time. And if you look back in 1890, it was actually a law, Mining Act prohibited women from working in mines in Canada. It was felt to be too dangerous for women, and the work was too strenuous. And you can see in the 1940s during World War II, and this is an image actually here of some women that were working for Inco, a nickel producer in Canada, for providing the metal for the armaments movement during the war. And those women were allowed to work in those roles at that time until the war ended, and then that was lifted. And so it wasn't until 1960, actually, when the legislation in Canada changed. And that's when women were then allowed to start working in surface plants in the mines. And in 1978 is when actually women could start to work underground. And that, for me, coming in 1988, which is just 10 years of time had transpired at that time. And so, of course, there would be very few women in the mining industry by the time I had entered. So it made sense for me. And I know at that time, the legislation changed as well. There was a lot more focus around pay equity. Particularly, I'm talking about Ontario, where I worked for my career. And there was a lot of, I would say, initiatives at the senior levels. So for every male engineer, they wanted to see a female engineer of equal competence being hired into the company. And for Inco, where I worked, it made a huge difference. All of a sudden, we went from, Samantha working in the mining company to having a group of 30 of us around the table. And so that it started to change the dial. And I will tell you, as a woman working in that non-traditional mining industry, that it was lonely, it was isolated, and there was a lot of good work happening in behind, and I'll share some of that with you. I know as we are in now 2021, you can see that there's new legislation around having women on boards. The Quebec government is leading the charge there, as well as CSA is starting to ask questions on what representation of women and men are on the various boards. So here's a graph, Samantha CAD, that I put together from the 1950s to today, and just showing the representation of workers between men and women in Canada. And you can see the slow, nice steady increase of women taking on more and more roles outside of the home. And like I said, 1960, when the legislation changed on the mining side, you can see a slow, steady rise in the number of women in the industry. And you can see today we represent about 16% of the workforce. So there's a lot of growing interest for women in the mining industry. And I would say more so in probably the last 10 years, and from what my perspective. And a lot of the impetus, I think, is the fact that there's been a lot of these women-centric work networks that were created, and for very good reason. Like I said, you feel quite isolated sometimes in your role. And so joining these networks is a good way to get support and to help to advocate together and to outreach to society and address some of the systemic issues that were unconsciously, I would say, biased within some of the sectors and industries. You see scholarships also coming out that encourage women into engineering and other types of non-traditional roles. themselves. And then with the advent of social media, you see a lot more role models. And this is just an example from Mining Association in Canada. They do an excellent job showcasing women in the industry. And in particular, we just celebrated, right, the International Women's Day on March the 8th. And you can see all the networking that was being done in celebration of the women. So in my role and with some of my fellow women in the industry, back in 2010, we sent out a survey. We really wanted to understand with the women that were in the mining industry, what attracted women to the industry, why were they staying in the industry, or why had they left, and what is the satisfaction, or what brought them satisfaction in working in the mining industry in particular. And so we sent out the survey. It went around the world, mostly Canadians, Americans, and Europeans. Some Australians replied. And these were the top requirements from those surveyed that they felt were the biggest, I would say, benefits or needs that they had in working in the mining industry, in staying in the mining industry, and in being satisfied in their role. And the top one, at the top of the list there, was by far mentorship and sponsors. And then they also identified the need for progressive policies and practices. And you've seen a lot of those types of changes with maternity leave, flexibility with work, even more so now with the pandemic, working from home, very different policies and practices. Really looking for professional development and opportunities to work and travel, particularly with global mining companies. And then, some of the more tactile PPE, like your coveralls, your boots, things that fit to a woman and her stature versus a man, and some of the infrastructure. And this is really around the changing rooms and things like that, just to make sure that those types of facilities were available for the women on the sites. So, my role in mentoring, I am a firm advocate, obviously, before and after that survey was done, to have mentoring, to be mentored myself. I actually stumbled across an article in a magazine once talking about mentoring, and I sort of sheepishly left it on my manager's desk, and he immediately took up the gauntlet, if you like, and reached out to me and said, Sam, anytime, I'd love to mentor you. And so it really changed my career, my path, my understanding, my opportunities with just opening that door for me. What I would suggest, if those of you on this call are interested in mentoring, is to pick someone you trust, to have that confidentiality with that person. Even a commitment agreement is always a good way, just to set expectations. Really talking about what things interest you, and I think scheduling those one-on-one sessions are really important. And as a mentor, you're really there to ask questions and listen and try and interpret and help to critique, if you like, or even coach your mentee. And at the end of the day, it's all around encouraging and empowering those being mentored. And I would say it's a two-way street. As a mentor myself, I've often learned just as much, I'm sure, as my mentee. For mentees, some of the advice I would give, we're talking about an engineering month here in the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and so this is an engineering focus. And beyond, there's no doubt that life matters most, and whatever you do in your career, and whether you're in a professional job and you're designing engineering facilities or infrastructure, or you're in your private life, you are always expected to preserve the public's health and safety. That's first and foremost at all times. Teamwork is something that is really important. To get involved in teams, be very focused on solutions, not so much on problems. Just always looking to a vision and moving the industry forward towards the sustainability, climate change issues. That there's lots for us to do, and just to keep your mind on that. Expanding your potential is And, I always think back to one of my mentors who had said to me, Sam, it's really important for you to feel uncomfortable, for you to grow. And so, be comfortable with discomfort because that you're growing your own potential. And, this is about embracing the future. There's technology all around it. We were just chatting before this call that, the new generation coming into the work world, into the engineering facility, I think are the ones that are bringing the future with them, being able to also embrace it and make the most out of it. And whatever you do, it's not about sitting in the stands, it's about getting on the field and getting active. So yeah, I just would offer, there's a number of mining related organizations out there like the CIM that has a mentorship program that you can get involved in. You can sign up and look at all those different opportunities for you and for you to get involved. And I would just, I'll leave it at that and just thank you for your attention. And I guess after our next speaker, there will be a time for Q&A. Thanks.
That's awesome, Samantha. So much of what you said just now really resonated with myself. I remember my first field assignment and I actually couldn't find work boots to fit me. So
Yeah.
Thank heavens that's changed. Yeah. I have the pleasure now of introducing our next distinguished speaker, Sarah Shortreed. Sarah is the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of ATCO. Reporting to the Chief Financial Officer, she has responsibility for the overall leadership of information technology. Her mandate is to expand and enhance ATCO's forward-looking enterprise-wide IT strategy and technology roadmap and deliver innovative strategies. Sarah is focused on delivering solutions and exceptional customer service to ATCO's global business. Sarah brings more than 30 years of global experience in many industries and executive roles spanning business consulting, complex multi-stakeholder program management, operations, P&L, sales, customer relationship management, and product management. Sarah was recently the Chief Information Officer at Bruce Power and previously worked at BlackBerry, IBM, and Union Gas. She holds a Bachelor of Engineering Science degree, Mechanical, from the University of Western Ontario. Sarah sits on the Board of Governors for the University of Western Ontario and is the current chair of the CIO Committee at the Conference Board of Canada. She recently completed a term on the board of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, NSERC, as well as the Digital Advisory Board to the CIO branch of the Treasury Board of Canada. Welcome, Sarah, and I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that lovely intro, Kim. And just like the previous, like Sam, I've got to just figure out the button here and share my screen. So if you bear with me for one moment, I'll get the correct presentation for today. There we go. And I'll put it in screen show mode, which would be even better. There we go. Okay. So thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of your day to talk about these issues of, women in technology, women in cyber, women in engineering. And I think I fit in all three categories, which is always interesting. So I'll just take you through a few thoughts. And just like we opened the entire meeting with, I've had the opportunity to work across a number of organizations in my career, including work in the field as an engineer, building pipelines, work in big global companies. And currently I'm with ATCO. And for those of you who might be like me, I was born and raised in Ontario. I worked in Southern Ontario most of my career. And then I had the opportunity 18 months ago to join ATCO in Calgary. And I actually knew very little about the company. So I thought I'd just give you a 2-second overview in case you're wondering, who are these folks? Well, this is actually a very large Canadian-owned firm that's operating around the world as a holding company that owns a lot of sub-firms, and some of them you may know by other brands. So you may be familiar every time you drive by a construction site to see one of our ATCO work trailers that have been leased to the construction project for managing all the paperwork and things that go with construction projects. Or if you are from Alberta, you might know ATCO as the utility that does transmission and distribution of both gas and electricity throughout that province. But in fact, we operate utilities all the way from the Yukon to Australia, and including a recent award of the island of Puerto Rico has outsourced to ATCO the operation of its electric grid for the next 15 years as we try and build more resiliency into that grid to operate in difficult climate conditions. We also have ATCO Frontec, which provides logistics services to remote work sites, and business continuity and disaster recovery services for folks that find themselves without housing and clean water and food. We can come in and help companies recover in those circumstances. We also operate Neltume Ports. We're part owner in that corporation in South America, which operates a number of port opportunities. So we're really, if you look at the wheel, we're really looking at all the essentials of things people need in their lives. We need transportation, we need housing, we need energy, clean water, and food, because we also operate a catering company called the Blue Flame Kitchen. So really a diverse company and a Canadian gem, Canadian owned and operated. So just fantastic corporation. So when we look at, in my presentation, I think Sam gave us a really good overview of some of the engineering progressions, particularly in mining. But I've, over the years, switched into the field of computer science and cyber, and I run IT for the ATCO group of companies. So here's what we look at when we look at all the STEM fields, and then I'll comment a little bit on technology and cyber on the next page. So in general, this is a great Catalyst chart. And if you're ever looking for stats, etc., Catalyst is a fantastic resource to all of us. Women are less likely to pursue these higher paying STEM fields, and they're more likely to leave the fields. And so when we think about this, you know, we really have to look at it as a cultural issue and a global Canadian issue, global across the world, and very specifically in Canada, where some of our stats lag other countries, of how do we encourage people to go into these fields. I think that Sam gave you a sense of how exciting her world is. I love my job and I love going to work every day. And how do we translate that into the numbers? So I'll maybe just show you a little bit on the next page, because over the course of our conversation today and the questions that you bring forward, I'm hoping we get into some of these topics where we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, if you actually went all the way back to 1985, there were a lot more people, a lot more women in computer science, 37%. Now, many of them came out of math degrees, but today, if you add up math and computer science, the overall registrations in 2014, and this has gone up a little bit, it was 17% in 2014, and I think now that it's climbed to 20% undergrads. But this infographic had some dated information, but I love the infographic so much I brought it forward. And some of the numbers have not changed very much. For instance, in my role as Chief Technology Officer, which they can also be described as Chief Information Officer, in 2015, there were 17% women in those roles, and today there's only